Homeschooling is probably one of the biggest topics going on this fall, probably more than any falls I can remember. And if you're one of those people who are debating whether or not to homeschool or not, then you want to watch this video, because we're going to talk about that right now. Hi, this is Todd from Sniping, Rhino. In today's video, we're going to talk about homeschooling. Now, in our last homeschooling video, Jess talked about how we got into homeschooling and then gave some encouragement to homeschooling families. This video is going to be different because we're going to address it to people who don't homeschool but are thinking about getting into it. We're going to do that by talking about some of the advantages of homeschooling and then also addressing some of the concerns or misconceptions about homeschooling. But before we get into the video, if you're not a subscriber, hit the subscribe button and the notification bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming homestead related videos. That being said, let's get to the video. For people getting into homeschooling, one of the biggest things that you're going to worry about is, I don't know anything about teaching. I don't know anything about the education process. So what am I going to even teach my children? Are they going to be able to be taught to a level where they can compete with public or private school students? And the fact of the matter is it's 2020 right now. We're in the 21st century. There are so many different curriculum out there that you can purchase and get online that we never had when I was growing up. When I was growing up, I actually attended public, private, and was homeschooled. So I've seen all of them. And when we were being homeschooled, luckily we had parents who were involved in education, whether it's a teacher's aide or a principal. And so we were able to be taught in line with educational practices that are used in the public sector. But there really was nothing out there for a lot of people. And so there were some people who homeschooled, and really their idea of homeschooling was really teaching their kids nothing, and so sometimes there was a bad rap. But that's just not the case out there. There's so many different companies out there that are marketing products and curriculum to homeschooling parents that that's just not a problem anymore. And by all means, if you want to teach your kids a certain way with a certain where you're not following another curriculum, that's fine, you can do that if you're capable of it. But it's not something you need to come up with. All the way up until they reached high school, we used actually took different subjects from different curriculum that we thought was best. And so we were using like 3, 4, 5 different sets of curriculum from different places. And that's what we did. Now that they're in high school, we use a video-based one. But the thing is it comes with products that help you teach them. Teachers' books, there's usually numbers that you can call or emails, stuff like that. And you really don't have to worry about, hey, I'm not smart enough to do it. And so that's one of the advantages of homeschooling today versus 20, 30 years ago. Another thing that kind of makes parents hesitate on whether they should homeschool or not is, do we have the time? And the fact of the matter is you really have to have at least one stay-at-home parent to really homeschool, or somebody you can hire to do it. Because the fact of the matter is you need some level of oversight. Our boys get up in the mornings, and if for whatever reason we're sleeping in late, Jess is going through some medical stuff, and so she wakes up a little bit later. The boys, they get up, they do their chores, and they're going into homeschooling. We don't have to tell them anything, and that's great. It makes it really easy. But sometimes they're going to have questions, and so that's where your life situation is going to dictate whether or not you can homeschool or not. For us, it was easy. We made that choice. We were both working, but we made the choice to have my wife stay home and start homeschooling my children instead of teaching other people's children. And people, that may be a little scary. People may be like, hey, I don't know if we can do that. But what we did, and what some of our friends did, is they really did a cost analysis. And what we found is when you put in childcare, especially if you're talking with younger kids, as they get older it's a little different, gas, food, stuff like that, it actually wasn't a big cut to our budget when my wife stopped working to homeschool our kids. But that's something that you as a parent are going to have to decide for yourself. Now, another common question that people may have when they're thinking about homeschooling is, am I good enough? I'm not a teacher, I don't have a degree. I mean, the list can go on reasons on why you're not good enough to teach your kids. But what it really comes down to is just math. And not in a way of like, I have to know math. It's math in, teacher versus student ratio. So I got a bunch of blocks here, some Lego blocks, okay? Let's say this is a trained, solid teacher. I've got 20 red blocks here. And then this is me as a parent. I've got 4 blocks there. When I compare my skills versus this super teacher over here, we're looking at my, talents, my skill level, my knowledge is 4. And theirs is 20. And so looking just at that, there is no competition. This public school teacher has a huge advantage over me. But the advantage breaks down when we start talking student to teacher ratio. And so let's just say we have 20 students. Now that's not realistic because let's be honest, how many classrooms really only have a 20 to 1 student teacher ratio? It's usually a lot larger. There's a lot more students for that one teacher. But in this we'll say 20. And so when I spread my blocks out to all the kids in the classroom, I've got enough for each student to get 1 block of my skills, my time, and my talents. Now over here, and I'm going to use my family, we've got 2 students. So while I only have 4 skill blocks, I'm spreading it 2 per student. Now this is a very simplistic view of what I'm trying to show, but the fact of the matter is, even though I only have 4 skill blocks, each of my kids are getting 2 because there's only 2 students. So it's a 1 to 2 teacher to student ratio versus a 1 to 20. So if you're hesitating about getting into homeschooling because you're not good enough, let me tell you, just because they're going somewhere where the person has an education in it or whatever, specifically for that, it doesn't mean your child is going to get all of that, because they have to spread it out between all of their students. Okay, now let's talk about some of the arguments against homeschoolings or some of the misconceptions against homeschooling. And one of them is socialization. Let's be honest, in today's age, that's just not a realistic argument. My kids have been homeschooled pretty much their whole lives, and they've been all over the world. And studies show, and just watching my own kids, that they interact very well with other people, and not just people that act and like they do. They've been to other cultures, they've been all over the country, and it's pretty much the same. And they do it better than their public school educated peers. I mean, we live in a society that is very digital. There's tons of studies that have shown some of the problems that have arisen because people are so much in electronics versus interacting face to face. In fact, that's abuse of police powers or excessive force. Some of the studies have shown that people having grown up without interactions as much, a lot of the younger police officers, has caused some of that excessive force use. And so, but that being said, it's not like going to school is a social club. I mean, they're in class the majority of the time, and yes, they have interactions. But there are things that you can do as a homeschooling parent to be intentional to get them some socialization. And that can be done in many ways. We've are part of a homeschool group where we meet once a week. We haven't with the COVID, but we were meeting once a week. It could be in 4-H, it could be in Boy Scouts, it could be with football, baseball, soccer, something of that nature. In fact, where we homeschool, in the state we do it, it doesn't matter whether you go and attend a public school, a private school, or a homeschool. If you're in that school district, you can do any of that stuff. You can be in the band, you can play a sport, you can use a library, any of that. And so, whether it's something as being involved in your local church, there are things you can do to address that, hey, they're just not socialized. And the fact of the matter is, it's just, if you know any homeschooling kids, that's just not true. I'm sure that there's examples out there, and which leads to our next point. So the next common argument against homeschooling is that the kids are going to be socialized to be, you name it, whether it's bigots, hateful, whatever, or they're not going to be taught anything. They're going to have this huge parental control. They're going to be like robots who are, or people being led by a dictatorship. And there's a kind of a poor, saying that's a poor example, because you're looking at the extreme worst cases of homeschooling, because there are people who are like that, people who are raised and their socialization teaches them to be hateful, to be bigots, you name it. But you can just as easily go to the public school or private school sector and be like, these teachers are sleeping with kids. These teachers are selling drugs. These teachers are drug addicts. I mean, the list goes on. But to say that represents the majority of public school teachers is a complete falsehood. But to say the same for homeschoolers is a complete falsehood too. You can't use the worst example for something and say that's the norm unless you're willing to use the worst example for the flip side. And so you can't say, hey, homeschoolers are this and that, they're uneducated, they can't read, they're bigots and this and that, being controlled by some extreme fundamentalist family or extreme liberal family, whatever you want to say, and use that extreme minute case to represent all of it, unless you do it for the other side. And so people who are saying that, they really don't have their facts straight. And so if you're on the fence for whether you should homeschool or not, don't let arguments like that only focus on the extreme negative of one side and not of the other be your reason to not do it. So let's talk about really the last thing we're going to talk about on a hurdle to homeschooling, and that's going to be the price. Okay, because homeschooling's like anything else. You get what you pay for. And when we first started homeschooling, it was probably a couple hundred bucks for each of our kids, and that's for the lower grade. And as we progressively start moving up the grades, it got progressively more expensive. And now that they're in high school, we're using a specialized curriculum that it's video taught based, very similar to what schools are going to now. But we don't get it for free. And so it's, has some advantages. It's very easy because someone else is teaching the kids and we're kind of like a teacher's aide. There is, numbers we can call for help. Their grades, they get a accredited diploma at the end of it, so we don't have to worry about dealing with colleges not accepting our homeschool paperwork as being a diploma. They're going to get an actual diploma from an accredited institution, but that comes at a cost, and that cost is about $1,100 per student. So that's about $2,200 for us with two high schoolers. And so cost is really going to be a big thing in whether you homeschool or not. Now, for those of you who want to homeschool and the cost is what's keeping you from doing it, or if you do homeschool, one of the things we really need to do as homeschool parents or people thinking about homeschooling is to address this cost. In the district that we live in, it's a little bit under $7,000. I think it's $6,800 that the school districts we're in gets for each of our kids, that because we're still in their school district. They get that for our kids even though they're not educating our kids. And we spend out of pocket $2,200 for both our kids. So if you can look, there's a huge cost gap there. We really need to start talking to our legislatures at the state level and start trying to push, hey, listen, you know, I pay school tax and my property tax, and I will do that for the rest of my life, even when my kids aren't in school, and that's the way it should be. But is it really that? Would it really be that wrong if my kid's education, you know, I got some money from the state as well, especially if it's significantly less? And that's part of like what some people call school choice. As me as a parent, I should have the ability to determine the education of my children, whether that be in a public school, whether that be in a private school, or whether that be homeschooled. And it shouldn't have the state, who has taken my money to educate children, determine what level of education that my kids get. For instance, if I'm in a high poverty area, I shouldn't have my kids forced to go through a school district that isn't quite the greatest purely because I'm poor. And so if you're looking at homeschooling and you're looking at the cost and being like, hey, I really can't afford to do this, talk to your state and local representatives and senators and start pushing this. I mean, we as parents should have a choice, at least somewhat of a choice, on the education of our children. And we shouldn't have the state forcing that down our throats. Hopefully you've enjoyed this video. If you have, leave a comment. If you have a question, leave us a question. We'll be willing to ask it, especially if you're looking at getting into homeschooling. We do have a little bit of experience, and if you watched the video my wife did, you know that her master's down is on education, is focused on education. She has years of experience as a teacher in the public school system, private school system, and as a homeschooling parent. And as always, if you're not a subscriber, hit the subscribe button and the notification bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming homesteading and homeschooling videos. This is Todd from Sniping, Rhino saying, have a great day.